Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to this exciting event centering the stewardship and display of Hawaiian featherwork, with a great lineup of speakers here with me tonight. So I'm really pleased to have them with me. I am Alice Christophe, and I am a curator and head of Oceania here at the British Museum. And I'm also the lead curator for the exhibition Hawaiʻi, A Kingdom Crossing Oceans, which is an exhibition that is here on the display at the British Museum and open in January 2026 and is now closing in just a few days on May 25th at 5 p.m. So if you've not seen the show yet, please do come and visit before closing if you can. Truly, this exhibition and the gathering of ancestral and contemporary works that are in the space is really once in a generation. So please come along. The exhibition Hawaiʻi, A Kingdom Crossing Oceans, was shaped through a co-stewardship process involving people in Hawaii and in London, including the speakers that are joining us tonight for this event. So again, very pleased to have them here. This show, the exhibition, it tells the story, and a really important story that centers cultural exchange and allyship, a story that really continues today through this profound collaborative work. Hawaiian featherwork can take many forms, and for the purpose of this event tonight, we won't be able to take you through the diversity of featherwork across the show and across Hawaiian context, but we will center more specifically on ahu'ula, or feathered cloak, give you a glimpse of a few other things in the show as well when we start. But perhaps we should say that feathered cloaks, or ahu'ula, played in the past and continue in the present, continue to play an important role in international diplomacy for Hawaii and for the Hawaiian Kingdom. And so in the exhibition, Hawaiʻi, A Kingdom Crossing Oceans, featherwork and ahu'ula are very much a thread through the show. And there was a concerted effort on our part as a collective to have featherwork be present in each sections of the exhibition. And I think we have succeeded to this regard, and we're excited to take you through some of these visuals. At this point, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker here in this lineup, in this great lineup, is Noelle Kahanu. She's a member of our exhibition stewardship group for the exhibition Hawaiʻi, A Kingdom Crossing Oceans. Welcome, Noelle. Noelle is a curator, a writer, and an educator. She's an acting director of the Museum Studies Graduate Certificate Program in the American Studies Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And she was a co-curator for the Hawaii Triennial in 2025. Again, welcome, Noelle. Leah Caldeira, who is also a member of the stewardship group for the exhibition. Welcome, Leah. And she's the director of Bishop Museum Library and Archives, the interim director of Bishop Museum Press, and also a curator for cultural resilience at the Bishop Museum. Leah was the editor for the book, one of the editors for the book Na Hulu Aliʻi, Royal Hawaiian Featherwork, a really important resource on Hawaiian featherwork, which was published in 2015. She's also the author of a great essay in the exhibition book that focuses on mea hulu, or again, Hawaiian featherwork. Welcome, Leah. Hattie, Keonaona Hāpai, is a second-year master student at the UCLA Getty Interdepartmental Program in the Conservation of Cultural Heritage. We had the great pleasure and privilege to welcome Hattie over the summer 2025 for a conservation internship at the British Museum. And during her time at the BM, at the British Museum, Hattie prepared important mea kupuna, Hawaiian ancestral works for display, including kapa, for instance, but also ahu'ula, or feathered cloaks. So welcome, Hattie, and thank you for all your work in the run-up to the show and your continued work with us. The last speaker, Nicole Rode, is a conservator in the Organics Conservation Studio of the British Museum, where she specializes primarily in the conservation of textile. For the exhibition Hawaiʻi, A Kingdom Crossing Oceans, Nicole focused on the physical care and mounting of Hawaiian feathered cloaks, so ahu'ula, amongst many other great things that Nicole worked on in the run-up to the opening. Thank you also to Nicole for all her work, and welcome to you. And so with these great speakers tonight, we will take you on a journey through, again, a reflection through the stewardship and display of featherwork, their importance throughout the show. And what we thought we could do for you tonight was first taking you through visuals of the exhibition and look at featherwork as a thread through the show. So we'll just do a quick run through to give you a sense of how truly they are present across the space. And then we'll pass it on to Leah and Noelle to reflect on the importance and presence of mea hulu in the space. And they, in turn, will pass it on to Hattie and Nicole, who will tell us more about physical stewardship, cultural stewardship, but display and mounting of featherwork with a specific focus on ahu'ula. So they will show you some of their great work and process into mounting and preparing these ancestral works for display. And then we'll open the floor to a conversation with Noelle and Leah leading the way and take a few questions. So without further ado, I will take us through a quick run through the exhibition and the presence of featherwork on display. So just quickly to give you a sense, again, featherwork is present across the space. In the first part of the exhibition, we've collectively advocated for and succeeded in creating this gathering of aliʻi, or chiefs, right? It was really important for us to create a display that evoke and invoke the presence of chiefs while reflecting on the absence as well in the space and the absence of names in the records. So this display that you see here in front of you, which has become quite iconic when it comes to this exhibition, is truly this representative of this effort to create that gathering. Here you already see a diversity of mea hulu with ahu'ula or cloaks, but also mahiole, helmets, some lei hulu or necklace and head ornaments that are present here, as well as kahili or feather standards. And here, I'm sure Nicole and Hattie will take us through their own work in mounting some of these garments as worn. This space truly, we envisioned this display as one that could be walked around. And so I'm giving you a glimpse here of the space around this opportunity to truly be in the presence of these mea hulu. And just a quick glimpse of a couple of really important pieces that we presented here with, on the left, an ahu'ula actually associated with a named chief, kahikili, so a name that has been retained in the history of our records, a high chief of the island of Maui. As we progress further in the exhibition, there's this really important moment in the show when, for the first time in 100 years, we've brought back to light this very large ahu'ula, again, or feathered cloak, sent by Kamehameha I to King George III of the UK. This ahu'ula was sent in 1810 in March, just 1 month before Kamehameha completed the unification of the Kingdom of Hawaiʻi, and it was sent together with a letter asking for protection and support from the British Crown. So in the exhibition, this ahu'ula faces a coronation surcoat associated with the British monarchy, and in particular with George IV, who ended up becoming the recipient of the ahu'ula and the letter. And as you can see on this image, they're facing each other in that space. And we can see these sort of vibrant colors coming into conversation, and these monarchical bodies really facing each other in this effort to create a balance in that relationship through this display. A further glimpse into that combination through these images here with this very large, again, ahu'ula, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again shortly. So going quickly through this, but with the letter side by side, a letter where the signature is attributed to Kamehameha I, and you can see here his handwriting with, on the right, in that space again, the coronation surcoat of George IV. In the exhibition, the central section is dedicated to the journey of Liholiho, or Kamehameha II, and his delegation to the UK, a journey that he started in 1823, and eventually they arrived in 1824 in May. And in this space, we've gathered really important pieces of featherwork that are associated with this journey. Just giving you a glimpse again, in other events, we've taken you through that journey, but of just the scale of that undertaking, a journey that took 5 months at sea, and a journey that involved featherwork. And we know Ahu'ula were on board that whaling ship with the delegation, crossing oceans to both Brazil as the first stop and to the UK. Speaking of Brazil, in the space, you can see this really powerful piece, this ahu'ula, that was gifted to the British consul of Brazil, of newly independent Brazil, by the delegation in 1824 when they stopped in Brazil. In the space, you can also see really important pieces that continue to be in the Royal Collection Trust today, on loan, on long-term loan to the British Museum, and on loan for this exhibition. These pieces that you see here were gifted by the members of the delegation that came with Liholiho and Kamawalu to the UK after the King and Queen passed in London. The rest of the delegation was able to have an audience with George IV, and during this audience, they gifted these very pieces that are here on display to King George IV. In return, King George IV also presented gifts, which is what you see, this pocket watch here on the right. Further into the space, we also see how ahu'ula have inspired really important documents that are, tell the history of the Hawaiian kingdom and continue to be part of, expression of Hawaiian sovereignty today. And one of these pieces is this ahu'ula that we saw earlier, associated, we believe, with High Chief Kahekili of the island of Maui, which we believe may have been used as a source of inspiration for the person who designed the Royal Hawaiian coat of arms at the College of Arms in London, upon a request from envoys from a king of Hawaii called Kamehameha III. And here you can see how an ahu'ula that was at the time of the design in 1843 here on display at the British Museum was integrated into the first draft of the Royal Hawaiian Coat of Arms created in London. And this design actually continues to exist in Hawaii, and you can see it if you've ever been to Hawaii and to Honolulu on the gates of Iolani Palace still today. Towards the end of the exhibition, we present other pieces of mea hulu. Again, ahu'ula are present there with this great short cape that has this particularity where the different bundles have been tied to the net backing using a Western blue thread, something that we thought was really interesting in the idea of coexistence and bringing these different materials together in the making of featherwork. Other forms of featherwork are also presented in this space, and in this moment of the exhibition, we try to reflect on those that we don't fully understand at this time collectively. And over the last few years, we've done a lot of research and a lot of work all together to try to understand what these particular pieces of mea hulu were for. So we asked these questions in the space, and we wanted to show them quickly tonight because they're so important and the work is ongoing. So if you have any thoughts, please get in touch. A really important moment in the show is this gathering of these 3 akua hulu manu that are said to have left Hawaii in 1779. They are still here today at the British Museum, and they've paved the way for really important reflections on care and stewardship, helping us to bridge physical care with cultural care and spiritual care. So we also wanted to honor them in this space. Now that I've done this quick walkthrough, I will pass on the mic to Noelle and Leah to share a few thoughts about the presence of mea hulu in the exhibition, and then we'll go on to Nicole and Hattie for a deep dive into mounting and display.
Mahalo, Alice, for that wonderful walkthrough. I want to first of all express my gratitude to the British Museum, to you as the curator, and to all those at the British Museum who really participated, shared the joy and the delight, and also really felt the responsibility of what it means to bring out these feathered works from the collections, and to enable them to see the light of day in that sense. There's a kind of a global conversation that I almost want to, start with, because when we think about this, there are, by my quick calculations, over 170 ahu'ula that exist, that we know of, probably more that are undocumented. And of those, the British Museum possesses, or those in the UK, I should say, as many or more that are in Hawaii. So when we think about things that were created, brought into existence in Hawaii, and then departed her shores, and to think today, where are these these feathered images, feathered works, feathered cloaks, feathered capes? It is to pay particular attention to really the realization that much of them spread out all over the world, but with a particular concentration in the UK, and within the UK, a particular concentration at the British Museum. So the ability to walk into a exhibition and see so much of what is from and of Hawaii is really a momentous and special occasion. I like thinking about this wonderful exhibition within the context of two others that preceded it. Two major exhibitions that focused on featherwork. The first was in 2006, and it opened at the Bishop Museum. And the second was a collaboration between the De Young Museum and Bishop Museum, and that opened in San Francisco in 2015. I think what's interesting in thinking through these succession of exhibitions is the first one actually happened quite sort of in a black box in a way. It was a very darkened space, and then San Francisco was totally the opposite, kind of almost an art installation in a white box. And what we have here with this current exhibition is something really very textured and nuanced, with the colors and a kind of a evolution in a way of approach, really emphasizing the political context as opposed to purely the materiality. So maybe I'll just stop there, but and invite Leah to jump into the conversation. But for me, it's the specificity and the political context that makes this exhibition different from others that focused on ahu'ula.
Thank you, Noelle, and thank you also to Alice and Mahalo for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation today. Picking up where Noelle kind of took us in terms of the genealogy of featherwork exhibitions, the exhibit in 2006 at Bishop Museum, and then the exhibition Real Hawaiian Featherwork at De Young. In all of that, there were moments of context, but a lot of the conversation centered around what is featherwork in general, what is its purpose, how was it made, what birds were utilized in the process. And to have an exhibition that, even in the slide that we are seeing right now with the gathering of aliʻi, to invoke their presence, and then further conversation about particularly aliʻi associated with certain ahu'ula, I think brings a new level of engagement with ideas that are woven throughout the course of this exhibition and in the catalog as well, accompanying the exhibition. One sort of little point that I would like to mention in terms of the way that often museums and authors speak about featherwork, speak about ahu'ula, is the use of the words associated versus belonging to. And while that distinction seems very small in the course of researching provenance and researching history of ahu'ula, it is quite important to understand that distinction. And so when something is, an ahu'ula is associated with an aliʻi, that usually implies that at some point the aliʻi had the ahu'ula in their possession, whether it was commissioned, whether it was actually theirs, whether they acquired it by some other means, but at some point they had it in their possession and gifted it, or dispersed of it by other means as well. And an example of that is the ahu'ula of Kahikili, which we've seen in this presentation so far. And that particular ahu'ula was gifted to Captain Clerk, who was the officer in command of the HMS Discovery. And that gifting occurred in November of 1778. So we don't know if that ahu'ula actually belonged to Kahikili, but at some point he had it, and it was gifted to Captain Clerk. As an example of the idea of an ahu'ula belonging to an aliʻi would be that of Kalaniʻo Pu'u of Hawaiʻi. And there are documented accounts of Kalaniʻo Pu'u removing the ahu'ula from his shoulders and placing it on to Captain Cook. So we know there that that ahu'ula belonged to him. And I think that association, that knowledge that it was actually on his person, and the power and the care and the mana that represents, I think also is incredibly important in a larger conversation of ahu'ula, especially as that particular ahu'ula of Kalaniʻo Pu'u was gifted by our Maori cousins, by Te Papa Tongareva, to the people of Hawaiʻi, and is now cared for at Bishop Museum. And so that belonging to this particular aliʻi makes that gift, I think, all the more impactful and meaningful. Noelle, did you want to follow up with something on that?
Yeah, I think it's this idea that aliʻi were known by their ahu'ula. So there's this citation, and they're talking about chiefs on the battlefield. And it says, in the history of the chiefs, that 4 times 40 chiefs came, 400 in all. Everyone had a beautiful feather cape and feather helmet for the head. Hawaiians called these feather-clad chiefs kawela o kaua, likening them to rainbows or rain heated by the sun. So we can imagine, right, this battlefield and all of these aliʻi wearing these ahu'ula. And from afar, you would know who they were. You could tell by the patterns, the colors on these ahu'ula. And they were made, each ahu'ula was made specifically for that chief. Leah writes beautifully in the catalog about purposing and repurposing ahu'ula, and that they become sort of these political, they have political weight in these diplomacies and these exchanges, but their original intent was to honor and celebrate and spiritually, perhaps even physically, protect the chief for whom it was made. And these ahu'ula will always bear that association, that embrace of he for whom it was made, right? And that's why, and we'll get there, right? But that's why the mounting of these ahu'ula on body forms is so important, because it evokes that original presence. And why also it's important to have that chief facing you, and not have their back turned. It's yeah. And then the one thing I'll maybe just add is, when we think about in a society that had so much natural beauty and natural wealth, what was the most important were these feathers, right? These bundles of feathers, hulu o na manu, and they were reserved for the aliʻi. And why? Why feathers? It is because these are the birds that flew closest to the heavens. It makes you also think about, well, think about chickens. You know what I mean? Like, was there a status? I think we can ask ourselves, was there a hierarchy among even the feathers that were gathered? But just the thought, as you look out into your world and you see what is closest to the heavens, what kind of materiality would convey the deification, the godliness, what captured that most. And for Hawaiians, that was the feather. And that was why it makes items made out of feathers and with feathers so much more manaful than others.
Thank you so much, Leah and Noelle, for this. I think there's so many great points there that open the way and lead the way to the next step here in this presentation. I particularly, love this idea of reflecting on the history of displays and exhibitions that have happened before. And it's true that in this particular show, we have that strong connection between ahu'ula, specific ahu'ula, and specific historical events and moments. And what I feel is that it really brings that notion of agency of these aliʻi into the space. And that's, I think, really powerful to experience. I also love that distinction, Leah, and I think your piece again in the book is really powerful in this regard of thinking through those words that we use in museum context, that we think, people will get it. And actually it's helpful to unpack belonging versus association. And this is something that collectively we were very careful about when we wrote our labels and our texts, as well as when we obviously wrote for the catalog. So something to pay attention here for our audience as you come back to see the show and as you experience the book. I'm also interested to hear, and I know they are coming, to hear from our conservation team here about these different points around materiality and how that affected their reflection around mounting. So I'll use this as a transition to bring Hattie and Nicole to the floor. Over to you, Hattie.
Aloha, and I just wanted to also echo some of the gratitude that's been shared for being able to be involved in this process, but also for the staff at the British Museum that has been so welcoming to us. So before Nicole and I get into the weeds of conservation and mounting of ahu'ula, including some of these topics that we've listed here, we first thought it might be helpful to have a little bit of a zoom out and breakdown of the how ahu'ula are made. So the base of ahu'ula is a netting or a nai made from olonā, which you can see in the image on the right, which is a fiber known for its strength and its flexibility. And you have these thick sometimes 6 or 8 ply braids that you can see here that are kind of providing structure. And the neckline in this ahu'ula is more of a flat trapezoidal shape, but other ahu'ula that we saw in the introduction had a little more of like a rounded neckline. And this nai, this foundational olonā netting, can also be made from multiple smaller pieces of nai, sometimes made by multiple hands. So you can see that this nai is a little bit of a darker color, and it's attached to this lighter colored nai. And then you can see these small bundles of wool that are bound together, also with olonā and attached to the nai, usually from the bottom kind of edge and then moving up towards the collar. So this can mean that for larger ahu'ula, there's millions of feathers. And they can actually be quite heavy, and some of the smaller ones that we'll show later are around 250 grams, a little bit lighter. But hopefully this image on the right of a visualization of this little uo on my finger can be helpful for thinking about how many feathers it took to make these. So while the foundational olonā netting can provide this cloak with ahu'ula with flexibility, they can also become kind of brittle over time, and the mounting has to be able to take into account like the support that these ahu'ula will need. And so in thinking about mounting, we looked to past and current displays to see how our predecessors were balancing multiple factors and considerations. And so we just wanted to go over very quickly a few general categories, starting with this first one, which is a flat display method that fully supports the ahu'ula physically. You can see the entirety of the design, but the audience may not be encouraged to imagine the ahu'ula being worn, and that can also separate the ahu'ula from living communities today. However, there's kind of a balance which these mounts are also quite easier and less time-consuming to make. We also have these halfway between a flat and a more cone-shaped mount that also continue to provide this full physical support and encourage a more rounded shape. So here's a combination of them being used in more like archival images, older displays, and then current displays last year. We also have these conic mounts that are closer, another step closer to the body form mounts, while also providing that physical support. And you can see that they're straight, they're closer to how they would have been worn, but they do kind of lack some of the physical characteristics like shoulders, which finally, when we get to these body-related shape or mounts, they present ahu'ulas closely to how they would have been seen and worn. However, the physical support that these mounts provide is not the same as some of the others that have been shown. And using these mounts also requires a level of care in avoiding complex legacies of museum displays, looking at kind of like museum dioramas and trying to avoid those. And so in the context of the exhibition, we refer to these mounts kind of as worn. But I'll hand over now to Nicole to kind of talk through like condition and some of the considerations for display.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having me on this. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be part of the conversation, so thank you. I just thought I wanted to, going off from what Hattie was saying, I just want to zoom out a bit and just acknowledge why certain of these mounts might have been chosen, because there's always kind of different priorities that are pushing and pulling at different people in exhibition development when these decisions are being made. So Hattie's already touched on the curatorial reasons, so the priority to mount an ahu'ula in a way that supports the curatorial narrative. But the other major factor is, of course, the condition of the ahu'ula. To what extent can we handle or manipulate these ahu'ula without causing damage? Because many of them are at least 200 years old. So even though they are in remarkable condition for their age, and they might not show explicit damage like tears or splits, and actually many of them show very little feather loss. It's quite amazing, really. But the fibers and the feathers will naturally have become weaker through age. And so the condition of each ahula will be a major factor when we decide what is possible for mounting. And I'll get back to condition in a minute, but I just didn't want to disregard the other constraints that we always need to work in. I mean, and they can be quite mundane. Sometimes it's just the size of the display case might only be able to accommodate an ahula in a certain shape, for example. Or perhaps the mounter or conservator has very limited time and budget, so they have to just keep the mount really simple. And then the length of the exhibition will have a major factor, major influence on what kind of mount will provide enough support for that time frame. So something that's suitable for 4 months might not be what you would choose for, 2 years or something. So for this exhibition, there were pretty much 2 types of mounts. And the first type of mount was to present the ahula, was to present the majority of the ahula that were given as political gifts from the surviving members of the visiting Hawaiian delegation, so in September 1824. So in this context, I think you could argue the ahula are sort of representing kind of like the bonds between the two nations. And so they were displayed flat and fully opened out in the exhibition. And then we have the 5 ahula that are in the showcase that is suggesting the gathering of the aliʻi, a gathering of chiefs. So here we wanted the ahula to serve kind of one of their original purposes and read as chiefly garments and kind of make a connection, I suppose, to absent bodies and kind of evoke the aliʻi. And then finally, on the very right-hand image, we have an ahula that kind of bridges those 2 categories. So it was given as a gift from Kamehameha I to ultimately to George IV, who received it. But in this display, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Elise, we can kind of argue that the cloak, the ahula, is supposed to, at this stage, is supposed to, in this exhibition, is sort of representing Kamehameha I. So he's looking out and meeting George IV. So like the other 5, we wanted the ahula to suggest his presence and make a connection to an absent body. So I just wanted to come back to condition, just because when you are mounting something as worn, or in a shape, it can involve a lot of handling, which obviously in turn puts stress on materials. So both, I suppose, when you're getting the ahula onto the mount, but also just the vertical display itself. So we assessed the condition of each ahula, and from there we then worked with Elise to really figure out which ones could actually physically be mounted in the as-worn shape. So what were we looking at? We're looking obviously at the nai, at the netting structure. We're assessing how brittle the olonā fibre is. We're looking at the extent of any splits or tears. We're also looking at how dense the nai is. That was a major consideration, because if all else was equal, the more closely spaced the knots, the stronger the structure was likely to be. And then, of course, we looked at the condition of the feathers, and across the board on every ahula, these were consistently the most vulnerable material of every cloak. So we were looking for fragments of feathers that may have become detached, how much splitting and shedding of the barbules had happened. You can often see on the board that the ahula is resting on. There's often clues as to how vulnerable the feathers are. And then we're looking whether the feather bundles are still securely fastened. Has there been any pest damage in the past that may have weakened the structures further? All those sorts of things. And then, from there we can work with the curator to choose which ahula are physically strong enough to be mounted as worn. Keonaona, Hattie, you want to take over?
Sure. So we'll kind of move into looking at like how we were making the mounts and deciding on what body forms to use. And so kind of to understand this process, we took a general approach of looking at historic images, though these are quite limited and they can often have a Western bias or a lack of cultural context, which was important for us to keep in mind. We then tried looking for areas of wear, kind of areas of abrasion along an edge or a tie that could have indicated where these ahula were tied. Though there were few clues, if any, for us to find. Although one area of wear that we would find were these areas kind of like right here by the collar, which may have suggested that the ahula was handled a lot around this area and could imply something about how they were worn. We also made fabric test garments to better understand where on the body ahula may have sat, but we really want to be intentional throughout this entire process about making sure that we're caring for the ahula during this entire conservation and mount making process. By not storing or displaying them below waist level, for example, to show respect for them as chiefly garments. And so the ultimate question is also, how do you, when we don't know for whom these ahula were made, how do you decide on a mount? And so luckily for the smaller ahula, we were able to do some test lifts of the ahula onto different size body forms and share these images with our colleagues who are both on this panel, as well as contemporary hulu or feather artists, Kavika alum Nelmira. And so in trying to understand where the ahula sat on the shoulders and how the necklines kind of aligned, we found that the smaller ahula told us exactly where they wanted to sit and how they wanted to drape. So instead of the ahula conforming to the mount, it was more that we would mount them and kind of provide support to meet them where they were at. This was kind of the sentiments that we heard when we were discussing with previous colleagues who had done similar work, like Valerie Free, who is the conservator at the Bernice Pauhi Bishop Museum. So looking specifically at this smaller ahula, once we'd selected an appropriately sized body form that we're all happy with, we were able to start making the buckram mounts. And these mounts were a lot easier to make because the ahula are light enough to hold their own weight and could be just draped over this shaped mount. So the mounts are on buckram bust, which is essentially like paper mache, but with linen scrim and wheat starch paste, which dry to form a hard and sturdy structure. And then we use fa shape, which is a non-woven polyester that shrinks when you steam it. And so we steamed that over the buckram to give us a layer to stitch into when we were making the mount, which this mount was then covered with padding and black display fabric. An additional support was made of layers of cotton jersey, net, and silk, which was then added to the back of the mount to help support the shape of the ahula. And if you can see in the images above the finished mount, there's these little silk net puffs that help to support the natural drape of the shoulders. And these supports were made by Tui, or Tuihana Taiaroa Smithies, one of the museum's textile mounters, who we would love to shout out for her expertise and help that we're extremely, extremely grateful for. So then I'll hand it off to Nicole to talk about mounting the larger ahula.
Yes. Well, comparatively, I think trying to figure out what the larger ahula would look like as worn was a bit more of a challenge. Just because of the sheer size of them. They were just so big and so beautifully, sumptuously flexible as well. And I think just the way the shape affects how their weight is distributed. The one we're mounting in this photo here, and it weighed approximately 4 kilograms, which I realize doesn't sound heavy, but somehow they feel heavy. And so that all needs to be accounted for. And what it kind of prevents the shape and the flexibility and the size is that we can't really do any test lifts with them, because I think it's during the handling is when they're pretty much most at risk of getting damaged. So any handling we did just had to be really carefully planned out. And the number of test fits we had to reduce up to right down to an absolute minimum. Because you can see from the photo here, hopefully, that just lifting the cloak just took a lot of thought and obviously took a lot of people. It took a minimum of 5 of us, ideally 6, to lift it. And each one, we had its own custom made support pad. That's the white fabric there you can see, which is quite a thick, heavy pad that's covered in silk. So we planned to do that hopefully only once or twice with each ahu'ula. So this is where I think, Hattie, you mentioned the test garments. This is where the test garments really came into their own with the larger ones. They were instrumental and they allowed us to debate, you know, again, where the necklines would have sat, where the ties would fall, where the feathered loops might land on the body. But also from a conservation perspective, is also how much creasing would be caused by wearing them in different ways. Because obviously we want to, with something this old and this naturally aged, we really wanted to avoid strong creases because it's at the crease line that any weak fibers or feather will split. So these images of Hattie, me, Alice, and Tui were all over multiple sessions looking at different options of what shapes were physically possible to put the larger ahu'ula in, both from a curatorial perspective but also with that conservation perspective of making sure we weren't going to damage the ahu'ula when we did put it in that shape. So it's all about finding that balance. But I'm pleased to say because of these sessions, we did manage to get our test fittings down with the real ahu'ula to an absolute minimum. So for the first cloak, we had 2 test fits. The second cloak, we had 1. And then for the really large cloak, we had no test fits. We just mounted it once. So from that point of view, I was quite pleased with the process. And then it was also during our test fitting sessions that we came to realize that the ahu'ula that was given by Kamehameha I to ultimately George IV, who received it, was not quite what we were expecting, in the sense that normally ahu'ula are not supposed to touch the ground. And while we knew this with a big ahu'ula, it was during the sessions that we realized if this cloak was not supposed to touch the ground, the person would have had to been well over 7 feet tall in order to wear it properly. So I don't know if Leah or Noelle, you want to come back to that, to this cloak as well, and that discussion that was had about it being presented in the way that we did, with all sort of beautifully spilt, sort of pooling onto the floor. But we can go on to the next slide, Hattie, for a minute. And I'll just quickly run through sort of the physical side of how we actually made the mounts. Because usually for something this large, as well as your fixings, you use a certain amount of friction to hold the garment up. So you'd be adding something like fabric covered supports, maybe to fill the voids in between the hard mount, the buckram sort of paper mache mount, and the garment, to provide a level of nap just to hold everything up. But in this case, we couldn't use friction, because I hope you can see in the photo, because on the reverse of each ahu'ula, there was loads of feathers that had poked back through the nai. So anything we used that helped support it with friction would, obviously, when we come to remove the ahu'ula, is going to take all the feathers with it. The other challenge was that you actually have very little contact between the ahu'ula and the hard mount. It's sort of, and that's hard. And that's part. It's hard because there's not enough support, or as well as shaping, because it touches the top of the back. But then because of the curve of the back, the ahu'ula sort of separates and falls away. And then it probably, may have rested a little bit or skimmed the bum and the legs on the way down. But obviously our mount didn't have any of these. So we had to find a way to provide additional support for the weight, but also additional material to help shape it. And so we did that in 2 ways. The first was a huge number of layers of stiff nylon netting, which was built up to fill the void between the buckram mount, so the hard mount, and the cloak. And I just, again, here, like Hattie did. I just really want to acknowledge the work of the museum, one of the museum's textile mounters, Tui Hana Taiaroa Smithies. She made all the buckram mounts for the large ones and developed all the stiff nylon netting. So the cloak is attached along the top with the Velcro, and the rest of it rests in many parts on this stiff nylon net structure underneath. Which I should say is covered in silk, so that when we do come to remove the ahu'ula, the feathers on the underside won't obviously be affected. So that was one of the ways we gave a little bit of extra support to the weight, but primarily also shaping. And then the other element of support we carried out was a temporary conservation treatment. And so, as you can see in these photos, the three larger ahu'ula, we partially lined the cloaks to help take the weight. So I won't go into loads of detail, but you can see this is a treatment midway through, and you can see I'm applying strips of long fabric that are stitched to the back of the cloak, just through the not through the nai, or around the nai. And at the top of each strip is a patch of Velcro, and so that Velcro will attach onto the hard buckram mount. So all of these strips are sort of working to lift the weight of sections of the ahu'ula onto the hard mount. And as you've seen before, here they are on display. And I think, you know, the whole process was just a really wonderful opportunity to explore how the ahu'ula may have, just from a physical sense, may have sat on the body, how they may have draped, how they may have been worn. But of course, with something this naturally aged, we always have to have a balance with the fact that these are historic garments that are weaker now than when they would have been worn. So that's always going to compromise the shape you can put them in. But I think we have a good balance. The mounting gives a good level of support for a short-term display, and also just supports the ahu'ula in a shape that brings back their original function, or one of their original functions, and hopefully they can be read as chiefly garments and suggest the presence of the aliʻi in the space. So it's a real privilege to be able to work on these.
So we would once again like to thank Tui Hana Taiaroa Smithies, who is the textile mounter that did so much work with us for the exhibit. Our collaborators with whom we consulted with, including our fellow panel members, as well as Valerie Free and Kavika Lamnelmita, and also those who have done the work, similar work before us, from whom we were inspired by, such as Rangita Katla. Mahalo.
Thank you so much for this. This is absolutely extraordinary to see these photos of the process. I mean, during the process, I used to come up and peek at where you guys were at and answer questions when it was needed, and hopefully just be playful with solutions at the beginning, and then look at these different options that you were bringing up. But being able to see some of the things that were happening between these short visits is a real privilege. So thank you so much for taking us through this. I love that you end with this particular slide and this slight, train onto the plinth here for the ahu'ula sent by Kamehameha I to George III and then received by George IV. And I thought perhaps we could open the floor to Leah and Noelle to start with that in our conversation. You were both involved in that reflection around how do we go about that height. And this question, if I understand well, is framed around this kapu, or to translate it simply, a sacred law that prevents ahu'ula featherwork from touching the ground. And so that meant that usually we try to raise them off the ground, but in this case we made an exception. Would you like to jump in, Noelle and Leah?
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I think in a contemporary context, we look at these historical references to ahu'ula, and they become for us these tenets. They always were treated as such. or they never did this, or you only pass them on to lineal descendants. Only, you know, I mean, and in a way, I think over time it becomes a sort of lore. But I do think that probably there was more flexibility in how ʻAhoʻula functioned in their time. And I think this is a wonderful example of weighing kind of what would have been considered, you know, you never do this or you never do that, with the understanding of actually when you attempt to mount it, that there is this reality of, you know, being over 7 feet tall. And so I think that the decision that was made was the right one, in the sense that there actually is at least one reference to kind of a aliʻi wearing an ʻahuʻula that trails behind them. And it's interesting because when you see the photo on the right, it is almost as though that layer of yellow on the bottom does touch the ground and sort of flare out in a really beautiful way. So I think in a way it speaks to the fact that sometimes you don't know until you try, and you guys had one shot at it, right? It's not like you're going back and forth 3 or 4 times. And I just want to point out too that the brilliance of these mounting techniques and the curatorial decisions around display have everything to do with the fact that you have a case that can be seen in the round 360, right? So you can walk behind these cases and see the full splendor of the design that would have been seen from the back. That is stunning. So many of us would just sort of spend a lot of our time on this particular case actually behind it, right? Looking at, and I'm talking about the gathering case, just looking at it from the rear. So beautiful. And so important, this decision to see them from the front. We get to see how the makers intended these designs to meet in the front. And even so, the one like in this gathering, it would be the 4th one, kind of from the right. It has these little shoulder, I mean, it's a hoaka that then reaches out and embraces the shoulders, but you wouldn't even really know that until it's on the body form. So really the brilliance, it speaks to, I think, just the brilliance of these ancestral makers who had such understanding of body and shape and design and color and form to create these incredible works of art, really, that had such an important function, the spiritual protection and celebration of our aliʻi.
Thank you, Noelle. In maybe expanding upon the conversation about the ʻahoʻula that is draping on the ground, I think that combination of what the conservation team was able to accomplish, along with a curatorial vision that was really rooted in context and relationships between Hawaii and the UK, between aliʻi and aliʻi, between aliʻi and King George III, really at the time in 1810 when it was sent. What we know is that it was sent with a letter. It was sent to George III. We don't know if it was worn. Likely it was. Was it worn in this particular form? Was it extended? We don't know, but it was gifted. It was gifted as a part of this relationship. Whether it was gifted for the purposes of being displayed, whether it was gifted for the purposes of being worn, I think that in thinking through the way that this particular case faces that of the circle of King George IV, so that they are face to face, so that they're actually in conversation. That relationship, I think, is, for me, the important part of what is happening here. And all these details that we're talking about make it more impactful. But truly, we know that this is a gift. We know that it's marking a certain point in time, a relationship that was desired, a relationship that was cultivated. And so I think that notion, for me in this particular area of the exhibition, was most impactful. And the brilliant work of the conservation team and Alice's curator allowed that moment to happen, allowed us to feel this relationship prior to moving forward into the exhibit, into that central section, which discusses the journey of the Hawaiian delegation to the UK.
Thank you, Leah, for this. I'm jumping in just because I have this memory of going up to the conservation studio to spend time with Nicole and Hattie and Tuihana. And you, Noelle and Leah, at different points in the process where obviously you came in person, but there were moments where we met on Zoom. And there were also moments where we were in touch through messages and so forth. And I remember that we were collectively reviewing that display system and working with the test garments, because as you shared, Nicole and Keonaona, you only had one final fitting, right? So the test garment was very much employed in adjusting. And I remember this feeling of, we had this tape that we see on some of your images, and we were first trying to make it fit in the footprint. And this ʻahuʻula was just taking over the floor, and we were thinking, oh my God, we need a bigger case, so we need to put it higher. And there was this balancing of constraints, really very real constraints that we deal with. But then there's this magical moment where we're just moving up the pole. And there is a little conservator for scale here on the right, Monique Poulan, who graciously jumped in the photo. So we give you a sense when the ʻahuʻula is not touching the ground of how tall that aliʻi would have been if this is intended as worn. And I just remember this moment when you guys on the other side of the world, where we're deciding, okay, this is intentional. There's something happening about the making here. We need to listen. And I love this notion. I see this through your work and through this presentation of learning by doing, right? That makahana kahike. And that's really been a thread through this process, that we've learned so much about the intention of these makers that perhaps when you don't engage in that practice in that way, you sort of miss. If you go full board and mount flat, you miss those details that Noelle was mentioning with where does that crescent, that hawaka sit on the shoulder? How do these triangles at the front actually come together to create buttons like patterns? And then what is this length about? So in all of this, I wanted to add too that this cloak we shared at the beginning hadn't been on display. This cloak sent by Kamehameha I to George III and received by George IV hadn't been on display for over 100 years. And I sense that in part it was because of how challenging it was to mount it, and the space you need for it to be, if you don't mount it as worn, the space you need, the span of this piece, you need in an exhibition. And so just again, emphasizing the amazing work that the conservation team did, with also people in Hawaii supporting to make this happen. I mean, this is a moment. So I just wanted to interject there.
And I want to interject too, in terms of Alice, the curatorial brilliance of pairing the ʻahuʻula with Kamehameha's letter, with finding it, requesting it, and then bringing these two elements together. So Kamehameha closes the letter by saying that he was sending a feather cloak and beg your acceptance. So we've talked about, in this cross-cultural context, how it was a royal insignia that could both validate the letter's authenticity and pledge Kamehameha's commitment to future relationships with the king. And in that sense, you know, when we're thinking about the political capital or the value that these ahu'ula played in terms of the relationship between these two kingdoms, I just kind of want to go back to something that Nicole said earlier, which was the decision to lay flat those ones that that were brought by King Liholiho and the delegation as specifically as gifts. We know that that was their intention. But I think for us in our co-stewardship capacity, as we were talking and thinking through the significance of the centrality of the Liholiho, the delegation's visit to London, and then the tragedy that ensues after by virtue of his death and that of Kamamalu, was the understanding that these that when they passed from the outset, when they were in their hotel rooms, that the ahu'ula were spread out all over them, that they were laid flat and really as an effort to kind of surround these aliʻi, and that in that sense they're transcending this notion of political capital and are really returning back to that original service of care, celebration, honoring, protecting the aliʻi. And so that to me was the invocation that occurs with that flat mounting in that darkened space.
That question around purpose versus function, I think, is really interesting. And we see in the center space, as Noelle was just sharing, that there's different ways of approaching the ahu'ula that are in the central section, but truly the pieces that are around the show. Just wanted to ask quickly maybe to Leah, who's contributed that great piece in the catalog and does mention that in the essay. Could you tell us a little bit more, Leah, about this overall sort of sense of honorific purpose versus the different functions that these ahu'ula specifically can have over time and how they sort of shift through time and space?
Absolutely. I don't know that they are in contrast in that way in the verses, because in all the functions and the uses of ahu'ula, really, it is honorific. Whether it's a gift, it's honorific. Whether it was created and used in its initial inception on the body of an aliʻi, it's honorific. But the function of it absolutely does change. A single ahu'ula can change over time in terms of the way that it's used, and that is reflected also in the exhibit itself when we see this gathering of aliʻi, where the aliʻi are wearing ahu'ula, to a gifting section, to the distinction in mounting, to the central piko section where the ahu'ula that the delegation brought as gifts were really utilized around the space in this sort of mourning fashion for the death of our aliʻi. And that same ahu'ula then was gifted after to the monarch at the time. And there's also differences in, well, not differences, there's also changes in the way that an ahu'ula is understood through time, even within a name. And, you know, as an example, when Queen Kapi'olani of Hawaiʻi traveled to London in 1887 for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, while she was there, she purchased an ahu'ula whose provenance is not necessarily known, but she purchased this ahu'ula, brought it back to Hawaiʻi, and renamed it Kekaulike. And it was then used by members of her family, of the Kalakaua family, in various occasions and instances, including use in a parade, including use for events with the Royal Societies. And so I think that also that understanding of the way that an ahu'ula's life changes, like all our lives, we go through periods, we go through phases, and that life doesn't end. It continues on. And the life of these ahu'ula continue on today into museum spaces, into other spaces where we are interacting, forming relationships between the people that care for them, between community. And in all these instances, I don't feel that ahu'ula remain fixed into one particular moment in time. I think it's important to look at ahu'ula and in a way remove that time component, in a way understand its entire life. Remembering also, as Noelle mentioned earlier, the initial purpose, the initial intent made for specific aliʻi is absolutely crucial, but there's a life that the ahu'ula experienced after that as well. And to recall all of that together, and to bring all of that together in the way that we understand them now, I find very beautiful, actually. And I hope that we can continue in terms of even the way that we document provenance and the history of a piece, that we can continue to include information that perhaps wasn't recorded in the past. Those hands from the conservation team that worked on it, that put their care and love into making sure that these ahu'ula are stable, able to be in exhibitions, or even their care for ones who maybe weren't in the exhibition, but still require this physical, cultural, spiritual care. I think that's incredibly important. And I hope that those names and those associations and those relationships and the relationships that are being built and maintained and cultivated today are documented and truly become a part of the histories of these ahu'ula.
And I love that. And I love this idea of thinking about their futures as well. You know, we are this moment in time, but their journeys will continue. And how does what transpired with this exhibition and the co-stewardship that happened, how does that then help us to inform their future travels and journeys? But I did have a question for our conservation duo here, if you don't mind. One of the textile conservators, Maori, Rangi Te Kanawa, worked for many, many months on the ahu'ula of Colonial Pu'u, who was referenced earlier by Leah. And she remarked on how by cleaning the feathers and working on the ahu'ula, that she envisioned that she was working, you know, getting him ready for his homeward journey. And it really speaks to this kind of intimacy that happens. You folks work closer than anyone else in terms of proximity and time and attention with these ahu'ula. So can you maybe speak a little bit to what it's like to be so intimate with ahu'ula?
I think that's a good question. I think, especially on something where you know it's such a privilege to work on these ahu'ula. I think when I'm working on something for a long time, and well, even for a short time, actually, I know where it starts. I get up from the computer and I put my apron on, and I feel like when I put my apron on, now I'm going to care for something. It's like it kind of almost transforms the day. It's from the work part of the day, if you know what I mean. And that now I'm going to care for something. And then, so I'm with the ahu'ula, but in my caring apron, so to speak. And I think I don't think I'm thinking particularly. I think I'm you almost go into like a flow state of where I'm just I'm really calm when I'm working and caring for. I feel like I'm helping whatever I'm treating to live longer and to maybe Hattie, you want to say how you do it?
I do agree that there is some sort of like flow state, like a level of calm that you reach where you're because I think everything that you do has to be very intentional. There's an image that we showed in the beginning of the presentation of a little feather bundle that was on my knuckle that had kind of become loose during one of our test lifts. And so that was a case where we knew exactly where that wool had come from. So we were able to reattach the little wool. And that was, as Nicole mentioned, kind of a time of being in a flow state where you're very focused. And I think the intention, of course, because this ahula was going to be in this case that is a gathering, that you are also kind of preparing someone to be in this like gathering space, in this meeting space with others, so that they're all, you know, like as one, and they're all meeting together and making sure that everyone's kind of, or helping them to look their best in this meeting where they're meeting with each other, but so many people, both Kānaka, but also others who are visiting. The exhibition will also be passing through, so to think about the many meetings that they'll be having and how do we also prepare them for this meeting and then for whatever may come. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really powerful to see how working with these treasured works and these collections, that may be tying to the past, actually, pivot us all towards the here and now, and then towards the future, right? And I think that's perhaps a great way to close this wonderful session. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us tonight. I think we'll carry forward this idea that aha'ula are shifting in their functions, and there's this entire life, as Leah pointed out, that's has unfolded, but this life that continues to unfold. So we're looking to the future, at future care with all of our hands, all of your hands, gathering in those spaces, but also future movements, we hope, to create that strong connection between Hawaii and the UK and continue that into the future. So thank you everyone again for joining. Many thanks to our audience for coming tonight and for staying through this wonderful session. And please, again, if you have not yet seen the exhibition Hawaii, A Kingdom Crossing Oceans, you have until the 25th of May. It's a Monday. It closes at 5 p.m. Please come into this space and experience these great aha'ula for yourself and other pieces of mea hulu in the space. Mahalo nui and have a nice evening.